let's look at this Michael Knowles story. So Michael Knowles apparently got into a debate about the brains of trans people, and we've covered this a few times on stream with the social construction of sex. Basically, is how we view it. Whether or not trans people have different brains, whether or not it matters. I'll give you a rough outline of my take, and we'll fucking move on to the debate and maybe cover some stuff in detail. People have this, there's kind of like this little conflict between whether gender is like a biological category, whether it's a social category, or whether it's a category of identity, right? And then, so I guess for if you're fully in the identity sphere, you'll say it's self-ID. If you say you are the thing, then society should just accept that you are that thing. When it comes to gender, the social thing is maybe more around performance, that like gender is kind of like a social role that maps on, like, I guess mostly to sex, but not always. And people might and that kind of explains trans people, but like, yeah, societies basically have a collection of social roles that are broadly associated with each biological sex, and then people perform in that way. It's like the Judith Butler thing. And then the biological aspect of sex, which can be often a very transphobic thing, which is like, yeah, your chromosomes are your sex and they're also your gender, right? They're unchangeable, and it's just your chromosomes, whether or not you produce the small or the large gamete, what genitalia you have, all that, and some intersex in between. But biological can also suggest that and there is some preliminary evidence that suggests that the brains of trans people are a little bit different from the brains of cis people, in the same way that the brains of men are a little bit different from the brains of women. Not better or worse, not more or less sophisticated, just different. Different size of the frontal gyrus, different levels of gray matter, different cortical thickness. And that might explain why transness is like a very immutable characteristic, or why dysphoria is. But I don't think any one of those three is completely invalid. I think being trans is like, there is some evidence that it's in the brain. There is obviously evidence that some of it is to do with social performance, because if you're trans, you will adopt the social role of women and adopt all these arbitrary pieces of social language, like the way you dress, the way you speak, the way you present, the way you walk, and everything. You'll adopt those things to speak the language, to communicate what your gender identity is. And identity, I think, plays a part in it as well, because it's like, you usually have to identify a certain way before you start pursuing social transition. And whether or not you identify that way because of something immutable in your brain is maybe up in the air, but it seems possible. So yeah, there's a lot of validity in is that tone, voice tone, dress, makeup? Is that, yeah. It's like social language, yeah. So that in mind, let's see what Michael has to say about it.
I have a study with me. It's from the European Society of Endocrinology that has found the brains of transgender people both operate and look more like their desired gender rather than the one that they were assigned at birth. The article states, the pattern of brain activation in both transgender and adolescent boys and girls most closely represented that of non-transgender boys and girls of their desired gender. In addition, GD or gender dysphoria, adolescent girls showed a more male-typical brain activation during a visual spatial memory exercise. Finally, some brain structure changes were detected that were also more similar, not identical, to those typical of the desired gender of GD boys and girls. Dr. Bacher, the doctor conducting the research, says, although more...
Now, if Michael Knowles is honest, he'll say he doesn't care what the research says, because we know he doesn't. He's partisan, he has an agenda, all that shit. Now, otherwise, he might just sidestep the question and try to look for gotchas, because he has a script, and this is not compatible with his script. Like, I think the temptation of the brain sex thing as well is it's probably the easiest way to get bigots to accept trans people, right? Because right now, the transphobic or the conservative position on transness is it's not real. They like the social construct explanations, and they like the self-ID stuff, because that's their way of saying it's all made up. And people are only trans because they were influenced to be that way by society. And if they can be influenced that way by society, they can be influenced the opposite direction as well. And we should just stop them from being trans by taking out of schools and taking out of the media and everything, because, God, trans people kill themselves. We don't want that. So that's the conservative position. The brain stuff is like the most unsettling thing, I think, for a conservative transphobe, because their current position right now is that being trans is fake. It's just like a made up thing. Anyway.
Research is needed. We now have evidence that sexual differentiation of the brain differs in young people with GD as they show functional brain characteristics that are typical of their desired gender. So then, Mr. Knowles, as established in the 14th Amendment, everybody is entitled to the legal protections as put forth in the Equal Protections and Due Process Clauses. So the interpretation of these clauses can be found in Griswold v. Connecticut, Loving v. Virginia, and Obergerville v. Hodges, the landmark cases enshrining the rights to birth control, interracial marriage, and same-sex marriage. So if the 14th Amendment stands correct, these legal bans on transgender care and their existence in general are therefore viciously in violation of the 14th Amendment. These laws are also not neutral nor generally applicable as required to have a law be constitutional. The precedent can be found in the rulings of the Employment Division, Department of Human Resources of Oregon v. Smith.
You know, I fear that I was going to be the only one to give a speech tonight, but I'm glad that I get to attend a speech as well.
I apologize for the longevity.
Queen.
So then, Mr. Knowles, due to your call for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. What do you propose we do? We cannot violate the U.S. Constitution, and seeing as these laws and bills are targeting and are only applicable to approximately 1.2 to 1.8% of people aged 13 to 17 and approximately 0.4 to 0.6% of the ages 18 and above, it is obviously and very clearly not neutral nor generally applicable. So I ask you again, what do you propose we do to address this issue that is not in violation of the Constitution and is humane?
There was a lot there, so let's take it from the top. You premised your question on the suggestion that men who identify as women, they actually have the brains of women, right? And women who identify as men, they actually have the brains of men. So
he could just he could also just say, well, the brain still has the XY chromosome, but because every cell in your brain has karyotype. But I don't know. Let's see where it goes.
I would ask you. Could you tell me a little bit more about the differences in the brains of men and women? How do men and women differ by their brains? Would you say one is a little smarter than the other, you know, one's a little sharper, or those women, maybe they're a little more emotional, men, they're a little
Now,
better.
all the scientific literature will say that the differences within brains are just different. There's no indication that one is smarter or more sophisticated than the other. As far as I remember, the superior frontal gyrus is different across men and women. Like it's got a different size. There are different thicknesses. There are different, even when it comes down to, I think there are different like neurons that fire at different, that fire at different, with different intensity in men and women. But the idea that it makes one of them like there's no way, we don't know enough about the brain to suggest that one is like going to make you holistically smarter or more sophisticated than the other, but yeah.
Better at,
gray matter levels are different as well, I think.
Keeping a level head. What would you say is the difference between the male and the female brain?
So some of the research.
But also, I think it's not dimorphic either. Like, it's just that there are two kind of like broad categories there. So there are lots of, so if you take like the average across all the male brains, you'll see a lot of like similarities and points where it's different from women's, but it's not like you can look at a brain and just be like, that's a male, that's a female brain. You can't really do it like that because there's a lot of overlap. It's a very, it's actually a very bimodal distribution of traits, but yeah.
Research that they've shown is different sizes of different portions of the brain. I don't have the actual like.
This is where it would have done well to she would have done well to just remember a few characteristics, yeah.
Facts in front of my face. I simply only have like the actual findings of the research.
I raise the question because I think you've unwittingly accepted a premise that is contrary to the liberal point of view and probably to a polite conversation, which is that men and women have these fundamentally different brains. And so if you're saying that men and women are...
God, he's such a fucking snake. Of course, like, he's going to try and shoehorn it into this, like, men are like naturally smarter than women or whatever. Like, yeah, okay.
Distinct categories, and for that reason, perhaps we ought to do away with some of the lies of the feminist movement and some of the lies of the homosexual rights movement. That's fine by me, but I think that these claims are a little bit dubious, and it also undermines the premise of transgenderism. The premise of transgenderism is that one's true self is not necessarily dependent upon one's body, so that one's sex is biologically determined, but one's gender expression is not biologically determined. It's socially constructed and can be whatever one wants it to be. But the case that you've just presented for...
So he's gonna, I think he doesn't like, yeah, I can tell like the brain thing is like very uncomfortable for people like Michael Knowles, but I think his way of sidestepping it is kind of bombarding as well. So he's already gone with that it's like anti-liberal because somehow, I don't, if it were proven that men and women had different brains, does that mean we should like roll back equalities and rights for women? Of course not. Fucking hell. The second one, he's saying that that it undermines the trans thing because he's going to do the straw man now because he thinks trans activists are unanimous in believing that gender is completely separate from sex, which again, some people will go with that line, but when he actually had to say gender expression, right? Like, how do we know your gender identity isn't rooted in some fundamental reality about you? Like, how do we know it's not mapping onto something real in your brain? Or if you're not just, how do we know you're not just like that because you're wired differently, right? And that's why the argument for trans healthcare for kids matters, right? That's why the argument for trans healthcare for kids matters, because although even HRT in surgery, which does have irreversible characteristics to it, is justified for a child if we can prove that they are trans or gender dysphoric, because at least gender dysphoric, because it's immutable, because we've been presented with enough evidence to know that this is how they're always going to be. Like there's no growing, they're not going to grow out of this. And that's why we do it.
Transgenderism is different than that. What you're saying is that actually transgenderism is biologically determined because the brain is an organ of the body. So what you're really claiming is that these men who claim to be women, they just are biologically women. So you're free to pursue more studies on this. The studies that I've seen are pretty scant, pretty weak, and are not particularly persuasive. But sure, you can have all of those studies. It still doesn't address the question of transgenderism, which is what happens when someone wants to identify as a sex that is different from their physical form. And in that issue, then we have to ask the question, can one really do that? And I see no evidence, including even if I believed all of those studies, which I don't, but even if I did, that still wouldn't make an argument for that point. So I think if you're going to...
It kind of does, though, because the question is, Michael Knowles, if you accept the studies, which again, I know he doesn't, like, it's so funny that he says it. Like, if you accept that being trans is, we don't even need to do the brain thing, okay? It might not be something that, like, it's not the case right now, okay? If someone's trans, we don't look at their brain and be like, okay, well, X or like fucking yes or no, basically. We don't do it like that. But if we can show that being trans is immutable, that does actually matter to someone like Michael Knowles, because then what do you do with them? You can't untrans them. Do we just make them exist in like total fucking misery? Do we just let them live in the closet for their entire life, or do we just let them commit suicide at like really high rates? And again, like Michael Knowles can bite that bullet, but it make him look pretty bad because he doesn't think that. He thinks that being trans is made up. He thinks that it's just like a mental illness that we would be better off curing in people, or just like structuring society in a way that less people become trans, like less people are socialized to be trans. That's what he believes. So.
Argue for the transgender ideology, you have to make the point that identity has nothing to do with the physical body, and that's absurd. And there are plenty of ways to understand the relationship between our metaphysical selves and our physical selves. Hylomorphism is the technical term that describes it. For at least 2,300 years, it's good enough for me, the idea that we're a union of body and soul, that sexual difference derives from the body and is an inseparable accident of the individual that persists as long as the individual exists. But it applies to the whole person because we're a composite of body and soul.
Wouldn't he counter they should be institutionalized or go to conversion therapy? Yeah, but which is why if transness was immutable, he couldn't argue for that. If he accepted the premise that she gave him, which is that when people are trans, they stay trans, then that's where the only way you eradicate them from public life is to genocide them. That would be the logical conclusion of what he's saying if he bit that bullet that being trans was real and immutable. But he's just going down the fucking pre-prepared like dialogue tree now, because like he's arguing with people who say that sex and fucking gender are completely separate and but she's not making that argument. She's actually making a much more nuanced, like biological argument for trans rights, right? Yeah.
So that's a reasonable explanation to me, and it served us very well for the entirety of our civilization. If the transgender movement has a different conception of what the person is, they're free to make the argument, but they haven't. What they do is they vacillate between mutually contradictory arguments. On the one hand, they'll say that my true self has nothing to do with my body. Then on the other hand, they'll make the argument you just made, which is that my truth self is entirely dependent upon my body. And so I think they've got to get their story straight, but I don't think that they
Wait, that doesn't matter though, right? There can be disputes within the pro-trans movement. That doesn't mean both sides are wrong. It doesn't mean it can mean one-sided, or it can mean that there are different aspects of it, because even if you accept all of the he said vacillate. Did he mean oscillate? Oh no. Oh no. Vacillating is what? No, yeah, it can still be vacillate, right? Going between, it's like being indecisive. No, he's fine. Yeah, okay.
can.
Oh well. We almost caught him having a Vosh moment. We almost caught him his vocabulary being exigent to the thoughts that he was trying to communicate. All right. So now, conveniently enough, I know that Michael Knowles does not give a fuck about what the evidence actually is, what the research says, and he'll admit that. He's admitted that as much. We've actually managed to catch him out admitting that.
This issue studied not through biology and not through some bizarre sociology course in a gender studies department, but through anthropology and through ontology and through philosophy. Because ultimately what this comes down to, I'm happy that all the scientific studies back up my view, but I wouldn't really care even if they didn't. Because the question is, what is the human person?
Thanks, Michael. I love it how your audience can be so fucking brain dead that you can, in the same event, because you did this in the one we just watched as well, is stand on a mountain of fucking scientific credibility, or the impression of scientific credibility, whilst saying you don't give a fuck about scientific credibility. It's so weird. And his audience are just like, yeah, you got the science, yeah. Doesn't matter if the science disagrees with you. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Stupid. He's a bad man. I do not like him. Do not like him one bit. Let's learn about the sexed brain, shall we? This is a really good little summary of the thing. It's a really short passage, but this just explained it really well for me. We'll see how far we go. This is a paper called Untangling the Gordian Knot of Human Sexuality. What's the biological basis of variations in the sexual phenotype? It's a really good essay just outlining, it's basically about the social construction of sex. It's like a really quick way to put it. And again, for the 8 billionth time, I don't think you need to prove a brain difference to say being trans is real, because transness communicates itself in multiple different ways. It seems to express itself a little bit in brain differences from what we know with preliminary evidence, but it's also the case that even without the brain differences, like obviously we know that transness expresses itself in a social way. It expresses itself in the way that people are, like trans kids will often gravitate to hobbies and interests of the opposite sex, which are all social, right? Like a trans girl at the age of fucking 8 playing with dolls is not really like an expression of biology, unless like, you know, that's like those are social role, and there's a lot of overlap there between social performativity and identity and biology. They all kind of like mesh into one another. At least that's how I understand it. And depending on what kind of argument you're having, you're gonna probably approach it from different ways, right? If you're talking about social construction of gender, you're probably going to talk about, well, like, what would you even go with that? Well, yeah, like how do I know the person I'm talking to is the gender that they are, right? Sometimes the best way to find out if you don't know is just to ask, because some people might present in an ambiguous way, or you might not know if someone's like trans or cis or whatever. Like, yeah, sometimes it's easier just to like let someone tell you, and that's why like the pronoun thing has got its uses. Or it's not generally expression of anything other than okay. Or you can start to ask questions to people who say like it has to be rooted in biology. You can be like, okay, well, what makes a woman then? Like, what's the purpose of a woman? And then they might go into some weird things about fucking gametes and gonads and genitalia and all this like reducing people down to their fucking biological traits, which they can do, but then you can go into the intersex thing, which is like, which one of these components do you need to be a woman, which is ultimately none of them, right? Even within, even if you exclude trans people from the discussion completely. Or you can talk about social utility of categories. Like we only really come up with man and woman, he, him, she, her, they, them. We only come up with these categories insofar as they're useful to people. And the question might be is, even if we accept everything they say about sex and the biology, what does society look like when we include trans women into the category of women? Then we can talk about social consequences like bathrooms, which is a bullshit concern, or sports, which can be debated maybe, like, or fucking crisis shelters, which seems to be a bullshit concern. Like, so yeah, there's a lot of ways you can address this. I'm just saying, like the brain and the biological difference is just one of them. So let's read this bit. Okay. Despite their existential role, our knowledge about the neurobiological underpinnings of sexual orientation and gender identity is very limited. The next frontier in the field of sex determination is to understand the biology gender identity, i.e., one's own perception of one's sex. Human sexuality is not only defined by gonadal and genital anatomy. The sense of whether one is male or female resides in the brain. The factors that create the gendered brain and gender identity are not clearly defined. Indeed, even the concept of gender-specific brain structure and function is being challenged. The incidence of gender dysphoria or transsexualism, is reported as 0.005% to 0.014% in natal males and from 0.002% to 0.0003% in natal females. But estimates are probably too low and vary considerably geographically. Current science continues to reinforce the concept of a spectrum of brain sex rather than a dyadic, clear-cut separation between men and women. Oh, I meant to say dyadic, not dimorphic. Because wait, doesn't dimorphic mean the same effectively as bimodal? Like, there are two distinct categories, but with a lot of overlap in between. Is that what dimorphic means? Sorry. My vocabulary is exigent to this understanding of... Okay. Joel et al. Comment that rather than two distinct, consistently characterized male and female brains, there's significant overlap between the two. The high degree of overlap in the form of brain features between females and males combined with the prevalence of mosaicism within brains are at variance with the assumption that sex divides human brains into two separate populations. Sex affects the brain, but the prevalence of mosaicism does not support the view that sex effects on the brain produce two distinct types of brains. Human brains do not belong to one of two distinct categories, male brain, female brain. Glazerman however, reflects the view of most biologists in that the brain is sexually dimorphic. He points out that the instrument Joel et al. Used was magnetic resonance imaging, essentially still images, as MRI for those who are not in the know. Which do not reflect the sex-specific differences in brain functionality. He writes, functionally, brains of women and men are indeed different. Not better, not worse, neither more nor less sophisticated, just different. The very brain cells differ chromosomally. Some facts, however, are clear. Genes play a critical role in determining brain sex. The genetic impact is irreversible. It cannot be reversed by gonadal hormones, although hormones also play a crucial role in behavioral development. The first evidence of the role of genes in sexing the brain was data from the zebra finch, whose sex-specific courtship behavior could not be changed or modified by hormonal/gonadal manipulation. You should only go live when Destiny is online. You should only come and chat when you don't have some fucking dumb shit. There, go away, loser. Bye 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 bye. Ooh, more recently, Duin and Villain observed that sexual differences were apparent in the mouse brain before gonadal differentiation and before differentiation of the adrenal glands. Both genes localized to the sex chromosomes and autosomal genes are involved. These investigators found that male and female mouse brains had different levels of more than 50 genes. Whoa. And then we're just looking at what some of these differences are. In spite of the intriguing idea that genes are probably an essential part of irreversibly programming gender identity, the impact of hormones on neurobiological morphology and gendered behavior is well established. Indeed, it is generally held that the fetal brain develops into a male brain under the influence of testosterone, and the female brain by default in the absence of the male hormone. The process is thought to occur, or at least to be completed, later in the development rather than genital differentiation. Other investigators point out that hormones reinforce gender identity. Oh, high exposure to high levels of androgens in utero increases the likelihood of the establishment of male gender identity, even when the subject is reared as female. They cite the impact of postnatal testosterone that occurs in boys from 1 to 6 months of postnatal life, predicting that it will be a more valuable period to study the impact of hormones on gender identity because studies of hormone concentrations before birth have not been done on the developing individual, but on maternal blood and/or amniotic fluid. On the other hand, Jordan Young points out that in females with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, this is just like one of the most interesting conditions. Anyway, the vast majority of genetic females with CAH reared as females have a female gender identity. Dessens et al. Reviewed gender dysphoria in CAH females and commented that the underlying mechanisms establishing gendered behavior and gender identity are not quite the same. They found that the majority, 94.8% of chromosomal females with CAH, had female gender identity. Billen's group discusses the data concerning the biological basis of gender identity and points out that studying transsexuals might yield insights into how this is accomplished. These investigators opine that the data concerning the genetic basis of transsexualism are extremely limited, and it is apparent that we will have to wait for further studies to establish the mechanisms involved in producing the contradiction between the sense of being male and female and an anatomy that does not correspond to that sense. Bao and Swab, emphasize the difference in timing between genital development, which is finished earlier in pregnancy than the sex brain, and point out that since the two processes are separated in time, they may develop in opposite directions. So that's like a pretty useful breakdown of how the the validity of the idea of like a sexed brain works. There's more evidence for it than people like to make out. I think a lot of people just dismiss it as like, oh, it's just like, it's all shaky evidence, the pink brain. But no, there's actually a bit more to it than what people are willing to admit. So yeah, that's interesting. Michael Knowles is a fucking moron. Anyway, nice one.